What You Don't Know. You Don't Know is the podcast that digs into the fascinating, the forgotten, and the flat-out weird corners of science, religion, politics, psychology, history, and more. Hosted by a curious duo, each episode is a lively and thought-provoking conversation that'll leave you saying, "How did I not know that?" If you're into peeling back layers, questioning what you thought you knew, or just love a smart and engaging chat, then this podcast is for you. So listen in, get curious, and know more. New episodes every week. Don't miss out on what you didn't even know you were missing. Like and subscribe.
Welcome in. Grab a seat. We are so glad to have you joining us at the table today because, well, the stack of notes and research we are looking at
is incredibly dense.
Yeah, dense but deeply, deeply compelling. We are tracking a timeline that spans, literally millions of years of human evolution, weaves through the heavily guarded rituals of ancient civilizations, fast forwards into modern neurobiology, and then lands right on the desk of the FDA.
Right. It is quite the collection of sources to synthesize today. We're looking at a cross-section of anthropology, neuropharmacology, theology, clinical psychiatry, and they are all intersecting at one very specific, rather controversial focal point in human history.
Our mission for this deep dive is to examine the infamous Stone Ape hypothesis. So we are going to explore the academic arguments proposing that a single fungus might have fundamentally catalyzed human culture, the origins of religious experience, and our very capacity for abstract thought. Okay, let's unpack this. Because to understand the core argument, we have to start with a massive anomaly in our own biological timeline. It's a physiological leap that completely obsessed a thinker named Terence McKenna.
Yeah, it's a biological anomaly that still generates significant debate among evolutionary anthropologists today. Because if we look back roughly 2 million years ago, our early hominid ancestors had a brain capacity of about 900 cubic centimeters.
Mm-hmm.
But then in what is effectively an evolutionary blink of an eye, we're talking a span of about 100,000 years, that brain size nearly doubled. It expanded to roughly 1,600 cubic centimeters.
But wait, couldn't anthropologists just attribute that rapid expansion to, a major dietary or environmental shift? The usual milestones we cite for cognitive development are the discovery of fire, the creation of complex tools, or a heavy transition to cooked meat.
You would certainly think so, right? But the timeline for those traditional milestones doesn't actually line up with the physical expansion of the cranium. The sources point out that the widespread use of fire and complex tool-making predominantly came after this massive brain expansion, not before. The brain grew first.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, the advanced physical manipulation of the environment followed.
So that creates a rather glaring gap in the evolutionary narrative. And that gap is exactly what McKenna was trying to fill when he proposed the Stone Ape hypothesis. He looked at the behavioral patterns of our nomadic ancestors, specifically the fact that they were tracking large herds of ungulates across the expanding African savanna.
Right, and tracking those herds meant they were constantly moving through environments heavily populated with animal dung, and there is a very specific fungus that thrives in that exact biochemical environment.
Let me guess. We're talking about the magic mushroom.
Precisely. Psilocybe cubensis. These early hominids were opportunistic foragers. They were hungry, they were constantly testing new food sources along the migratory trails. McKenna argued that it is highly improbable they would have simply ignored a prominent, nutrient-dense fungus growing directly in their path.
But consuming a hallucinogen in a hostile environment seems, incredibly dangerous for a primal species, doesn't it? Did McKenna base this purely on speculation, or is there empirical data suggesting this consumption provided an actual survival advantage?
No, he grounded his theory heavily in clinical data. Specifically, he referenced the 1970 Harvard experiments conducted by researcher Roland Fisher. Fisher was studying the physiological effects of psilocybin on visual perception. By analyzing that data, McKenna proposed 3 distinct dose-dependent tiers of consumption that would have practically benefited early human survival.
Let's break down those 3 tiers, because the data from Fisher's research completely changes the context of a psychedelic state. At Tier 1, the low doses Fisher demonstrated that small amounts of psilocybin actually improved visual acuity by 200%.
200%?
Yeah. The subjects could detect edge contrast, finer details, and track movement with significantly more precision.
So if you apply that to a hominid on the savanna, a 200% increase in visual acuity directly translates to being a vastly superior hunter and gatherer. Better hunting yields a higher caloric intake, and those surplus calories are an absolute biological prerequisite for supporting a larger, more energetically demanding brain.
Then we move to Tier 2, the medium doses. The research indicates this is where the psychological and sociological effects begin to take hold. Social boundaries start to dissolve.
And in a primal, tribal setting, the dissolution of those boundaries is critical. It leads to less intragroup conflict, increased resource sharing, and heightened emotional cohesion. From a strict evolutionary biology standpoint, tighter group cohesion and deeper pair bonding lead directly to increased mating. More mating means a higher likelihood of offspring surviving to propagate those specific genetic traits.
Finally, we reach the third tier, high doses. This is where the standard hominid operating system gets completely overridden. At high doses, the default sense of self, the ego, dissolves entirely. The brain begins processing abstract thought and complex symbolism. McKenna famously summarized this threshold by stating, "Language became music and music became language."
That's a great quote.
The sources suggest this extreme state of altered perception could have been the initial spark for raw, expansive consciousness.
But when McKenna first published this framework, the broader scientific establishment essentially laughed him out of the room. I mean, the term stone ape hypothesis was actually coined as a pejorative just to mock him. But he firmly maintained that this chemical compound didn't just passively distort reality, it actively synthesized the modern human experience.
And for decades, that remained a fringe theory. It wasn't until 30 years later that the technology caught up with the hypothesis. Scientists finally began placing volunteers in functional MRI machines, administering pure psilocybin, and observing the real-time neural activity. And the initial assumption in the neurobiology community was completely inverted. Researchers expected a psychedelic to cause a massive spike in localized brain activity, more electrical firing, more chaos.
Instead, the scans revealed a profound reduction in localized activity. The brain, counterintuitively, became much quieter. Specifically, one major architectural hub went almost completely offline, the default mode network, or the DMN.
For you listening, if you aren't familiar with the default mode network, think of it as the brain's executive control center. It is the neurological origin point of your internal monologue, the mechanism that generates the concept of I or me when you reflect on your own identity. It is the literal neurobiological seat of the ego.
And under the influence of psilocybin, that network is rapidly decentralized. The rigid boundaries separating the ego from external stimuli simply collapse.
Here's where it gets really interesting. Because when the default mode network relinquishes control, the isolated regions of the brain stop operating in silos.
Right, that phenomenon was meticulously documented in 2012 by Robin Carhart-Harris at Imperial College London. He termed it neural anarchy, though perhaps neural hyperconnectivity is more accurate. When the DMN powers down, disparate neighborhoods of the brain that rarely communicate suddenly construct massive, temporary neural superhighways.
The visual cortex suddenly begins transmitting data to the emotional processing centers. Memory networks bridge directly to the regions mapping physical body awareness. It creates a state of unprecedented, holistic neurological integration.
And what is truly revolutionary about Carhart-Harris's findings is the durability of that integration. These neuroimaging studies show that the newly formed synaptic pathways do not immediately degrade when the compound is metabolized. They can remain active for weeks or months. In several longitudinal studies, the psychological shifts appear to be permanent.
That durability completely changes the conversation. It implies the human brain is chemically primed to recognize and utilize this substance. Which brings us to the pharmacology of the compound itself. Psilocin, which is the bioavailable form of psilocybin once metabolized by the body, fits with absolute precision into human serotonin receptors.
Yes. Paul Stamets, a leading mycologist heavily cited in our sources, argues that this lock-and-key mechanism is far too precise to be dismissed as a random biological accident. He advocates for a framework of coevolution. The genetic data reveals that humans share roughly 50% of our DNA with fungi.
Half our DNA.
Exactly. We diverged from a common eukaryotic ancestor over 1 billion years ago. Yet, across that immense span of evolutionary time, these fungi manufacture a molecule perfectly calibrated to interface with the human neurological lock.
It reframes our entire relationship with the natural world. What stands out to me is that ancient cultures did not require fMRI technology to understand the gravity of this interface. The historical sources document civilization after civilization treating these compounds as sacred technology. They weren't viewed as recreational intoxicants. They were utilized as deliberate instruments for unmediated communication with the divine.
We see that reverence embedded at the very foundation of Western philosophical thought. Consider the Eleusinian mysteries in ancient Greece. For roughly 2 millennia, this agrarian cult held the most sacred, intensely guarded secret in the Mediterranean world.
The stakes surrounding this ritual were incredibly high. Revealing the details of the Eleusinian rites was a crime punishable by death. Every September, initiates would walk the sacred way from Athens to the sanctuary at Eleusis. Inside the telesterion, they would consume a specialized brew known as the kykeon.
And the list of known initiates reads like a curriculum vitae of Western civilization. Plato, Aristotle, Sophocles, Cicero, and Roman emperors, including Marcus Aurelius. They were all bound by a vow of silence regarding the mechanics of the ritual, but their subsequent writings share a unified thematic revelation. The experience eradicated their fear of mortality and revealed an interconnected cosmos.
For centuries, historians speculated about the ingredients of the kykeon. But in 1978, archaeochemical research provided a definitive answer. The brew contained ergot, a naturally occurring parasitic fungus that grows on rye and barley. And the primary psychoactive alkaloid in ergot is lysergic acid-amide,
Which is the naturally occurring precursor to LSD. Therefore, the architects of Western logic and philosophy were routinely participating in guided, high-dose psychedelic ceremonies. And if we look across the Atlantic, the Aztec Empire developed an equally sophisticated parallel framework. They utilized psilocybin mexicana, which they explicitly named Tionanacatal, translating to flesh of the gods.
When the Spanish conquistadors and Catholic missionaries arrived in the 16th century, they immediately recognized the threat this posed to their religious monopoly. The indigenous populations were having profound spiritual experiences without the need for an ordained priesthood or institutional hierarchy. The Spanish response was brutal suppression. They destroyed the temples, burned the codices, and made the consumption of the mushroom a capital offense.
Yet the tradition survived. The Mazatec healers of Oaxaca took the rituals deep into the remote mountainous regions, meticulously preserving the sacred knowledge for over 400 years. What's fascinating here is the sheer ubiquity of this pattern. We see distinct, geographically isolated cultures, independently discovering and venerating these neurochemical keys.
Right. In the ancient Vedic texts of India, there are extensive hymns dedicated to Soma, a divine plant that reportedly bestowed cosmic wisdom. After decades of botanical and linguistic debate, researcher R. Gordon Wasson proposed that Soma was actually Amanita muscaria, the iconic red mushroom with white spots.
And that very same species was the cornerstone of shamanic practices in Siberia, though we must note their method of processing the mushroom was highly specific to their environment.
Very specific.
Right. Amanita muscaria contains high levels of muscimol and ibotenic acid, which can be highly toxic. The Siberian shamans observed that reindeer could consume the mushrooms safely. The reindeer's hepatic system filtered out the toxic elements, but excreted the psychoactive compounds completely intact in their urine.
So relying on brilliant indigenous chemistry, the shamans would literally collect and drink the reindeer urine to safely achieve the altered state.
This raises an important question regarding the pervasive influence of these compounds on global theology. The academic sources we are reviewing also delve into some highly provocative theories concerning the origins of Judeo-Christian theology. To be entirely clear to you listening, we are strictly analyzing the historical and botanical arguments presented in the literature, not rendering any verdict on faith.
Absolutely. The botanical parallels are certainly striking, though. The sources reference the biblical account of Moses and the burning bush. Several ethnobotanists argue the bush in question was likely an acacia tree. The bark and roots of the acacia contain incredibly high concentrations of DMT. When that wood is burned in a confined space and the smoke is inhaled, it induces intense, reality-altering visions that naturally last roughly 15 minutes.
There is also extensive analysis of the manna that sustained the Israelites in the desert. The Exodus narrative describes a substance that appeared overnight with the dew, had to be consumed before the sun melted it, and occasionally induced prophetic states. Botanically, that perfectly mirrors the rapid life cycle and decay of specific desert-adapted psilocybin fungi.
But the most controversial application of this lens comes from John Marco Allegro. He was a prominent philologist and one of the original scholars appointed to decipher the Dead Sea Scrolls. In 1970, he published a linguistic analysis arguing that early Christianity originated as an underground mushroom cult. He posited that the linguistic roots of the body and blood of Christ in the Last Supper were actually encrypted references to the cap and stem of the Amanita muscaria.
And the academic and theological backlash was instantaneous and severe. The Vatican condemned his work, and his career as a mainstream scholar was effectively terminated. However, regardless of the validity of Allegra's specific linguistic claims, the broader historical consensus from our sources remains intact. Knowledge of these psychoactive sacraments was widespread, and institutional authorities systematically attempted to eradicate it.
But the institutional suppression ultimately failed. The modern resurgence of this knowledge is a fascinating story of cross-cultural collision. It centers around R. Gordon Wasson, the same researcher who investigated the Vedic Soma. He wasn't some bohemian radical, he was a vice president at J.P. Morgan.
A Wall Street banking executive is certainly the unlikeliest catalyst for a global psychedelic renaissance. But in 1955, driven by historical curiosity, Wasson and his wife journeyed to Oaxaca, Mexico, searching for the remnants of the Aztec Tianacatl rituals. There, they met Maria Sabina, a revered Mazatec curandera. For reasons that remain her own, she permitted Wasson to participate in a midnight velada.
On June 29, 1955, Wasson became the first documented Westerner to undergo the sacred mushroom ceremony. He consumed the fungi, experienced the complete dissolution of his ego, and documented a state of absolute transcendence, viewing reality from a vantage point entirely detached from his own identity.
Because of his immense social and financial capital, Wasson was able to bypass the usual academic gatekeepers. On May 13, 1957, Life magazine published his extensive account under the title Seeking the Magic Mushroom. That single publication introduced the concept to millions of American households simultaneously.
It fundamentally rewired the cultural trajectory of the 20th century. Researchers at Harvard, namely Timothy Leary and Richard Alper, read the article and immediately initiated the Harvard Psilocybin Project in 1960. They began rigorously testing the compound on various demographics, leading to the landmark Good Friday experiment in 1962.
Conducted at Boston University's Marsh Chapel, the methodology was deeply fascinating. 20 divinity students were divided into two cohorts. 10 received an active placebo, and 10 received a high dose of synthesized psilocybin immediately prior to the Good Friday service.
The data from that afternoon is legendary. 9 of the 10 students who received the psilocybin reported an undeniable, profound, mystical experience, a direct, deeply felt connection to the divine. So the insight here isn't just that they had an intense psychological reaction, it's that a synthesized chemical was able to reliably and predictably trigger a state of consciousness previously reserved for lifelong mystics. It essentially democratized the experience of spiritual enlightenment.
Unsurprisingly, the sociopolitical establishment viewed that democratization as a profound threat to the status quo. By 1968, the U.S. federal government intervened, classifying psilocybin as a Schedule I narcotic. All legitimate clinical research was paralyzed for nearly 4 decades. The therapeutic application of the compound was forced entirely underground.
It wasn't until 2006 that the medical establishment finally breached that barrier. Researchers at Johns Hopkins University successfully published the first legal, modern study on psilocybin, and the methodology was incredibly rigorous. They utilized extensive psychological profiling before and after the sessions, employing the mystical experience questionnaire to quantify the results.
The resulting data completely dismantled the Schedule I criteria. They proved that a single clinically guided dose of psilocybin induced lasting, statistically significant improvements in personality metrics. Subjects demonstrated sustained increases in openness, creativity, and emotional resilience long after the compound had left their systems.
The momentum from that study compounded rapidly. By 2018, the FDA granted psilocybin breakthrough therapy designation for severe treatment-resistant depression. We're looking at clinical trials showing remission rates near 70%. Compare that to standard SSRI antidepressants, which hover around a 30% efficacy rate. SSRIs attempt to blunt the emotional impact of the default mode network. Psilocybin appears to temporarily reboot it entirely, breaking the deeply entrenched neurological loops of rumination.
We are witnessing similar, unprecedented efficacy in treating severe PTSD, chronic addiction, and end-of-life anxiety in terminal cancer patients. The very same biological mechanism that may have altered hominid cognition on the African savanna is now triggering a paradigm shift in modern psychiatry.
So what does this all mean? We have modern fMRI data, FDA clinical trials, and deep historical records all pointing to the profound impact of this fungus. Does that validate Terence McKenna? Did magic mushrooms physically rewrite the DNA of early humans and force the evolution of the brain?
While it is an incredibly elegant narrative, the rigorous biological consensus in our sources indicates a definitive no. The fatal flaw in McKenna's logic is his reliance on Lamarckian inheritance.
Right. Lamarckian evolution relies on the premise that phenotypic traits acquired during an organism's lifespan can be passed down genotypically to their offspring. Like, taking steroids doesn't make your babies muscular, or learning French doesn't mean your kids are born speaking it.
Exactly. Even if a prehistoric human consumed psilocybin, experienced massive neurogenesis, and fundamentally reorganized their default mode network, those acquired neurological traits do not rewrite the germline. A psychological breakthrough does not alter the DNA sequenced in a sperm or egg cell. Furthermore, if regular consumption of psychedelics was the primary engine of genetic evolution, we would expect cultures that integrated them continuously, like the Aztecs or various Amazonian indigenous groups, to have rapidly outpaced the rest of humanity in strict biological or technological development, which did not happen.
So McKenna accurately identified the profound impact, but he completely misunderstood the biological mechanism. We are not talking about an upgrade to the hardware. We are talking about an upgrade to the software.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the contemporary consensus emerging from these sources shifts the focus from genetic evolution to cultural evolution. Consciousness, in this framework, is an emergent property. The introduction of psilocybin didn't force the brain to spontaneously mutate new physical lobes. Rather, it unlocked latent capacities that the existing neural architecture already possessed.
It provided access to a hidden developer mode. The ancient cultures that harnessed this tool utilized that newly accessible software to construct complex mythologies, sophisticated art, and cohesive social structures. The chemical catalyzed shared ego-dissolving experiences that allowed groups of humans to coordinate and conceptualize reality on an entirely new level of abstraction.
And researchers like Paul Stamets argue that this process of cultural coevolution is actively occurring again today. As modern medicine integrates these compounds, they are rewriting our societal software, revolutionizing our psychiatric models, our approach to palliative care, and our fundamental understanding of neuroplasticity. The ultimate question isn't how the mushroom created consciousness, but rather what the nature of consciousness actually is, given that it interfaces so seamlessly with this specific molecule.
Which perfectly distills the ultimate realization we can draw from this stack of research. Despite our fMRI machines and double-blind clinical trials, science still cannot solve the hard problem of consciousness. We can map the neural superhighways, we can watch the DMN go quiet, but we still cannot explain the alchemy of how biological matter and electrical impulses generate the subjective experience of a thought or a memory.
No, we can't.
But what these sources consistently reveal is that human consciousness carries an inherent profound loneliness. We are burdened with the acute awareness of our own existence and our inevitable mortality. Perhaps the reason every ancient culture fiercely protected these rituals, risking death to preserve them, wasn't because the compound magically mutated their DNA. Perhaps they revered the mushroom because it reliably delivered the one thing human consciousness craves above all else, an undeniable sense of connection. By temporarily dismantling the rigid boundaries of the ego, it allowed the individual to feel fundamentally embedded in the fabric of their community, their ancestors, and the broader universe.
That's beautifully said.
I want to leave you with a final thought to mull over today as we close this deep dive. If a naturally occurring chemical compound, one that shares half of our genetic history, possesses the precise geometric key to shut down the brain's survival-driven ego center, and in doing so, reveals a pre-existing neural network capable of boundless empathy and cosmic integration. What does that imply about the baseline state of the human mind? Are we fundamentally wired for unity and deep connection, but simply blinded by the evolutionary programming required to keep us alive? It is something to deeply consider the next time you find yourself walking through the woods. Thank you so much for pulling up a chair and joining us at the table today. Keep reading, keep analyzing, and never stop questioning the world around you. We'll catch you on the next one.
And that's a wrap on this episode of What You Don't Know, You Don't Know. If your brain feels a little fuller or like it just stumbled onto something way more interesting than expected, smash that like button, hit subscribe, and tap the bell so you don't miss next week's deep dive into, well, something you didn't even know you didn't know.